In December 2010, 18 months after Michael Jackson's death, his estate released a brand new album. It was called Michael. It was supposed to be a gift to the fans, a final collection of unreleased recordings from the most famous voice in music history. Millions of people bought it, but within hours of the first single dropping online, something strange happened. The fans, the very people who had spent decades studying every breath, every ad-lib, every whispered note of Michael Jackson's voice, said something that the estate did not want to hear. That's not him, not a few fans, not a fringe group on the internet, thousands of them, and then his own family, and then Grammy-winning producers who had worked with Michael for years. The estate said they were wrong. Sony said they were wrong. They released the album anyway. What followed was one of the longest, most expensive, most legally complex music fraud scandals in history. 12 years of courtrooms, forensic experts, a mysterious singer who almost confessed, and a family that called Michael Jackson their closest friend while allegedly selling counterfeit recordings of his voice. This is the story most people never fully heard. To understand what happened in 2010, you have to go back to 1984. That year, a 7-year-old boy named Frank Casco met the biggest pop star on the planet. His father, Dominic Casco, managed a hotel in New Jersey where Michael Jackson frequently stayed. The Casco family, parents Dominic and Connie and their children including Frank and his brother Eddie, became one of Michael's most intimate social circles. Not acquaintances, not admirers, family. Michael spent extended periods at the Casco home in Franklin Lakes, New Jersey. He was present for birthdays and holidays. He was the kind of guest who didn't knock, he simply arrived and stayed. Frank Casco later described it as completely normal. Michael Jackson sitting in their kitchen, watching TV, playing with the kids. Over the years, Frank became one of Michael's most trusted companions. He was present during the darkest chapters, after the 1993 allegations, through the 2003 documentary controversy, and into the final years. In 2011, he published a book called My Friend Michael, 300 pages defending Jackson against every accusation ever made against him. He testified during the 2005 criminal trial, saying on camera, "I wouldn't be here if I thought that man was a pedophile." The Castillo name meant loyalty. It meant closeness. It meant trust. That is the context you need to understand what happened next. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009. Within a year, his estate, led by co-executors John Branca and John McClane, was under enormous pressure to generate revenue. The estate had inherited not just a legacy, but significant debt. They needed product. They needed music. In 2010, Eddie Castillo, Frank's younger brother, and his songwriting partner James Porte approached the estate with an offer. They claimed that back in the fall of 2007, Michael Jackson had visited the Castillo family home in New Jersey, and over several months recorded 12 original songs in Eddie's basement. 12 songs! In a basement, from the most meticulous recording artist who ever lived. The estate was interested. A deal worth potentially $250 million had already been struck between the estate and Sony for 10 albums of unreleased material. New songs meant new revenue. The estate moved forward. 3 of the 12 tracks were selected for the first posthumous album, Breaking News, Keep Your Head Up, and Monster. They were included in what would become Michael, released December 14, 2010. But before any of those songs reached the public, something had already gone wrong. In September 2010, the Jackson family was invited to a listening session. The estate played them the album, including the 3 Casio tracks. Katherine Jackson, Michael's mother and a direct beneficiary of the estate, said immediately that the vocals didn't sound like her son. She pushed back. She was ignored. Randy Jackson, Jermaine Jackson, and LaToya Jackson all made public statements, rejecting the tracks as fake. They were ignored. Jackie Jackson, one of Michael's oldest brothers, went further. He revealed that both he and estate co-executor John McClane had spent weeks insisting the tracks be removed from the album. His statement was direct. He and McClane had personally demanded certain tracks be pulled. The estate moved forward anyway. Teddy Riley, one of the most respected producers in modern music history, the man who had worked with Michael across multiple eras, was brought in to help with post-production. He later admitted that from the moment he heard the Casio tracks, something felt wrong. He felt, in his own words, like he had been set up. Years later, he would publicly apologize to Quincy Jones, who had also questioned the tracks, for dismissing the legendary producer's concerns at the time. Even Michael's nephew Terrell, who had initially given his blessing for the project, walked away from the studio after hearing the Casio tracks. He told people the voice on those songs was not his uncle's. The estate had the warnings of Michael Jackson's mother, 3 of his siblings, his nephew, and multiple award-winning producers. They released the album anyway, and then they did something that would define the next 12 years. They released a statement saying they had investigated the tracks and believed, without reservation, that the vocals were Michael Jackson's. On November 8, 2010, 5 weeks before the album dropped, Sony premiered one of the Castillo tracks on Michael Jackson's official website. It was called Breaking News. The fan reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, thousands of listeners were posting analysis online. They noted the vocals had an unusual quality. Certain sounds were pronounced differently. The signature Michael Jackson ad-libs, the claps, the foot stomps, the precise breath patterns that producers who worked with him had described as impossible to replicate, were absent. Some listeners claimed that specific syllables in the Castillo tracks matched a previously released song by a relatively unknown Italian-American singer from Maryland named Jason Malachi. Malachi had released a song in 2007 called Mamacita that had briefly circulated online as a supposed Michael Jackson leak before being identified as Malachi's own work. His resemblance to Michael Jackson's vocal style was so striking that a Pittsburgh radio station had once played it on air as an authentic Jackson recording. Fans had flagged this at the time. The background vocalist on Mamacita had even contacted TMZ to confirm that Jackson had nothing to do with the song. The name Jason Malachi had briefly surfaced in MJ fan communities as early as 2007, 3 years before the Michael album, as someone who could convincingly imitate the king of pop. That context made what happened next feel less like coincidence and more like something else entirely. Now fans were placing the Breaking News vocals side by side with Malachi's known recordings. The similarities were specific enough to be unsettling. On January 16, 2011, a post appeared on Malachi's Facebook page. It said, "Sheesh guys, I guess it's time to confess, it was me. It was me who sang Breaking News, keep your head up, monster, and stay." The post was taken down within hours. Malachi's manager claimed his account had been hacked. Malachi himself later said the post was photoshopped. Then he said it wasn't his page at all, but the damage was done. The name Jason Malachi was now attached to the greatest controversy in Michael Jackson's posthumous legacy. The estate's position, complete confidence, no reservations, began to crack under scrutiny. In 2013, a collection of all 12 Castillo tracks leaked online. Fans had access to the full set of recordings. Forensic analysis began in earnest. Fan and researcher Vera Serova engaged Dr. George Papkun, a forensic musicologist, to formally analyze the Castillo tracks. His findings were detailed and specific. The vocalist on the Castillo tracks used what linguists call a glottal stop, a pattern of dropping the T sound in the middle of words. The word waiting, for example, was sung as wayon. Dr. Papkun reviewed 39 years of Michael Jackson's recordings and found that Jackson never used this particular vocal pattern. The Castillo vocalist, however, used it consistently, and it was a pattern consistent with Jason Malachi's known recordings. A second independent forensic musicologist reviewed Dr. Papkun's methodology and reached the same conclusion. The estate responded by releasing a statement reiterating their complete confidence in the tracks. Meanwhile, Tony Curtis, Jason Malachi's longtime producer and close collaborator, had listened to the Castillo tracks and made his own assessment. He stated publicly that he knew without a shadow of doubt that the voice on those recordings was Malachi's. He confronted Malachi directly. According to Curtis, Malachi's response was that he could not confirm or deny his involvement. Curtis had a pointed observation about that answer. If you say, "I can't confirm or deny if I did that," you did it. In June 2014, Vera Serova filed a class-action consumer fraud lawsuit in California. The defendants were Eddie Castillo, James Porte, their production company Angelicson Productions, Sony Music, estate co-executor John Branca, and the estate's music arm MJJ Productions. Her core argument was straightforward. The back cover of the Michael album stated in clear language that all lead vocals were performed by Michael Jackson. She alleged that statement was false, that she and millions of other consumers had been defrauded into purchasing an album whose most controversial tracks featured an impersonator, not the artist they were paying for. Sony and the estate's initial legal response was remarkable. Rather than defending the authenticity of the tracks, they filed what is known as an anti-slap motion, arguing that the album cover constituted free speech, not commercial speech, and that they therefore could not be held liable for what it said. The argument was, in essence, that it was their constitutional right to credit the wrong singer on a posthumous Michael Jackson album. The judge rejected that argument and ordered the case to proceed. Sony then tried a different approach. In court filings, their lawyers conceded, solely for purposes of that motion, that Michael Jackson had not sung the vocals on the 3 tracks, but they argued they couldn't be held responsible because they hadn't known the tracks were fake. Eddie Castillo and James Porte, they said, had failed to disclose that Jackson didn't provide the lead vocals. In other words, we were deceived too. The judge at the time accused Sony of throwing Castillo and Porte under the bus. But the appeals court sided with Sony, initially dismissing them from the lawsuit. Serova challenged that decision, and the California Supreme Court agreed to review the case. In 2022, the Supreme Court ruled in Sarova's favor. The court found that the album's commercial speech, including the back cover attribution, could indeed expose Sony to liability for consumer fraud. If ignoring evidence was all it took to escape accountability, the court observed false advertising laws would be meaningless. Weeks later, on June 29, 2022, the three Castillo tracks, Breaking News, Monster, and Keep Your Head Up, were removed from all streaming platforms worldwide. A new version of the Michael album was reissued on CD without the three songs. The estate and Sony issued a joint statement. They said the removal had nothing to do with the track's authenticity. They simply wanted to move on. Here is the detail that most people never heard. In 2018, 8 years into the controversy, Jason Malachi hired a lawyer. According to investigative journalist Damian Shields, who spent 14 years researching the case for his podcast Faking Michael, Malachi was prepared to confess on the record. He wanted acknowledgement of his role. He wanted to be paid for the vocal work he had performed. And he wanted the tracks re-released under his own name, as Jason Malachi songs, not Michael Jackson songs. He was about to come forward. And then, according to Shields' reporting, which includes audio of Malachi himself, attorneys connected to the estate and Sony discouraged Malachi from going public. The confession was shelved. Vera Sarova's own attorney described the situation directly. He would have to be very strong to come out now and say, "I'm going to tell my story." Sony has some very powerful lawyers. Malachi, when contacted by Shields' team for the 2024 podcast, never denied singing the tracks. He said he would tell his story when the time was right. The time has not yet come. There is one more chapter to this story, one that arrived in 2026 and recontextualized everything. In February of that year, the Michael Jackson estate filed documents in federal court alleging that Frank Castillo, the man who wrote a book in Michael's defense, who testified for him at trial, who called him a brother, had approached the estate with sexual abuse accusations after years of publicly defending Jackson. According to the estate's filings, Frank Castillo received a payment of $3.3 million in 2020 following an approach through his attorneys. When that settlement was paid, the demands did not stop. The ask escalated to $213 million. When that was rejected, it came down to $44 million, brought through attorney Mark Garagos, the same Mark Garagos who had once declared on national television that Michael Jackson was absolutely 100% innocent. The estate filed for civil extortion. The federal lawsuit was ordered into private arbitration. Across 14 years, the Castillo family had sold recordings they claimed were Michael's voice, appeared on national television, defending those recordings, defended Michael Jackson's character in a published book and under oath, received payment from the estate under undisclosed terms, demanded hundreds of millions of dollars based on abuse claims, and simultaneously asked the public to believe all of these things happened in sequence without contradiction. Australian journalist Damian Shields, who had spent over a decade documenting the Castillo track scandal, described the arc as the biggest fraud in music history. There is no neat resolution here. The tracks are gone from streaming. The lawsuit with Sarova was settled, with no money changing hands, just the removal of the songs. Castillo and Porte are still being sued for fraud. Malachi has still not made a formal confession. The estate still has not issued an apology to the fans who purchased the album under the explicit representation that all vocals were Michael Jackson's. What remains are the facts that were documented, the warnings that were ignored, and the 12 years it took for 3 songs to be removed from the catalog of a dead man who could not speak for himself. Consider the full sequence of what was documented here. A family described by Michael Jackson himself as his second home. A claim that he spent months recording in a basement nobody else witnessed. Warnings from his mother, his siblings, his producers, all dismissed. A major corporation printing his name on a product that 2 independent scientists said wasn't his. A singer who almost confessed before being silenced. And a settlement reached quietly, without admission of wrongdoing, without refunds to the consumers who were allegedly defrauded. The estate described the removal of the songs as simply choosing to move forward. Not an admission, not a correction, just a decision to stop fighting. Whether the estate was deceived by the Castillos, or whether they knew more than they admitted and released the tracks anyway, that question has never been formally answered. What the court record does show is that they were warned repeatedly and specifically before the album came out. They chose to proceed. And then 12 years later, they quietly removed the songs and said they wanted to move on. The truth, as it so often does, took its time. But in this case, it is worth asking, if the fans hadn't pushed, if Vera Sarova hadn't filed her lawsuit, if Damian Shields hadn't spent 14 years investigating, would those 3 songs still be in Michael Jackson's official catalog today? The evidence suggests yes. Not the fraud itself, if fraud it was, but the machinery that kept it in place. The legal filings, the public statements of complete confidence, the silencing of a singer who wanted to tell the truth. and the fact that none of it was dismantled by the people with the power to do so. It was dismantled by a fan who filed a lawsuit, by researchers who analyzed vocal patterns, by a community that refused to accept what the institution told them was true. History rarely gives credit to the people who get there first, but in this case, the fans were right from the beginning. The question is, why did it take 12 years for anyone with institutional power to agree with them?